So today, we're going to connect two things that sound like they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. A huge, ancient environmental crisis and the invisible stress we all feel in our daily lives. We're going to explore how the story of one can actually help us understand the other in a really surprising way.
Let's start way back, over 2,500 years ago. The Persian king, Darius the Great, had this prayer carved into his tomb. And look at what he's worried about: war, hunger, and lies. Foe, famine, and falsehood. The crazy thing is, these three threats have been a constant theme throughout Iran's history, right up to this very moment. And that brings us to this huge paradox, this central question of the whole story. How on earth did one of the world's great, enduring civilizations manage to thrive in a place where almost all the land, we're talking 83% of it, is incredibly dry? There really shouldn't have been enough water. Well, the answer is a truly incredible feat of ancient engineering.
You know, when you think about ancient civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, what do they all have in common? Right, massive rivers. The Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, they had this obvious, visible source of life. Iran's story is totally different. It's a remarkable exception, because they had to find their river underground.
Okay, so let's get into how they did this. It's called a qanat, and it is absolutely brilliant because it works entirely on gravity. No pumps, no electricity. Here's the genius of it. First, engineers would go up into the foothills and find an underground water source, an aquifer. Then they'd dig a really deep mother well straight down to hit that water. But the real magic is step 3. They would then start tunneling horizontally, for miles and miles, at a super gentle, precise slope. Gravity does all the work, pulling the water downhill. And these vertical shafts you see, they're for ventilation and access, until finally that fresh water emerges out in the middle of a dry plain, creating a life-giving oasis.
Now, to really wrap your head around the scale of this achievement, get this. If you added up the length of all these hand-dug underground canals, it's estimated to be over 385,000 kilometers. That is farther than the distance from the Earth to the Moon. It's just a mind-boggling amount of collective effort, built up over centuries. It was a totally sustainable system, built to last.
But then the 20th century rolls around, and that entire ancient philosophy of sustainability gets thrown out the window. It was replaced by something completely different, a new mindset of industrial extraction and huge national projects that were all about progress at any cost.
So how did this shift happen? Well, it was a slow creep and then a sudden rush. In the 50s, cities get modern pipes. Then in the 60s, powerful pumps and deep well technology arrive, and they're sold as the modern fix for those old, inefficient qanats. Soon after, it's all about building massive dams, which became these huge symbols of national pride. And then after 1979, a new push for agricultural self-sufficiency just put the whole process into hyperdrive.
And the result of all this? Well, the numbers are just staggering. In the 1960s, you had about 30,000 deep wells in the country. By the 2010s, that number had exploded to around 800,000. They were basically pulling water out of these ancient underground reserves way faster than nature could ever hope to refill them. It was like they were just draining the national savings account.
Okay, so we've got this massive national crisis. But what does that actually feel like for a real person living with it day to day? And maybe more importantly, how can we even compare the stress of something so tangible, like a water shortage, to all the other invisible pressures of modern life?
Well, to figure that out, some researchers came up with this really clever idea called a strain token. Just think of it like a unit of measurement for stress. It lets us take totally different kinds of pressure, environmental, financial, even informational, and put them all on the same scale, so we can see how much of our personal stress budget each one is eating up.
So how does it work? Well, the formula is actually pretty simple. It calculates the weight of any strain using 3 things. First is exposure. How often does this thing hit you and how hard is it? Second is vulnerability. How sensitive are you, personally, to this specific problem? And third, and this one is key, is conversion. How easily does this one problem bleed over and mess up other parts of your life, like your health, your time, or your relationships?
Okay, so this is where this framework gets really, really interesting. We can now use it to look at a person in the city of Yazd, a place under a lot of water stress, and compare the weight of 2 completely different kinds of strain they might be dealing with.
On one side, you have the water shortage. This is a very visible crisis. Let's call it a resource shock. It doesn't happen every single day, but when it does, it's a huge disruption that creates a big, sharp spike of stress. But on the other side, you've got informational strain, the daily grinding effort of dealing with fake news, rumors, and just general misinformation. This is an invisible stress, a noise injector. It's this low-grade constant pressure that just wears you down, erodes trust, and creates these long, flat periods of anxiety.
So when the researchers actually mapped out how these two different stresses spill over into people's lives, the results were pretty shocking. A water shortage, as you'd expect, hits hard on health, time, and money. But that informational strain, it does its damage to a person's sense of dignity, belonging, and their ability to trust information. Now, look at the bottom line, the total weight. That invisible daily grind of misinformation actually adds up to be slightly heavier than the tangible crisis of not having water.
And let's zoom out for a second and see how this fits into the big picture of someone's overall stress. For this person, that daily informational strain is eating up about 26% of their entire stress budget. That's more than their economic worries, and it's way more than the water shortage, which, when you average it out over time, comes to about 9%. It turns out the invisible burden can actually be heavier than the one you can see.
And that brings everything full circle. We can finally connect the dots, all the way from those huge historical decisions and national policies, right down to the quiet personal pressures that people are feeling every single day.
So what are the big takeaways from all this? Well, thinking this way gives us three really powerful insights. First, that the invisible daily grinds can actually weigh more than the big dramatic crises. Second, how a problem spills over and contaminates other parts of your life is often the thing that matters most. And third, some types of strain are just amplifiers. They turn up the volume on everything else, making every other problem feel worse and harder to solve. And here's the final crucial piece of the puzzle. That big, historical shift away from sustainable water management didn't just create a water crisis. By creating an environment full of scarcity, instability, and mistrust, those policy choices from decades ago also built the perfect breeding ground for these modern, invisible strains to grow and thrive, adding to the total weight of life for everyone. And that really leaves us with a question for ourselves, doesn't it? This whole framework was about a specific crisis in a specific place. But the idea behind it is universal. It forces us to ask, what's the real total weight of life in our own communities? And what are the invisible strains, the noise injectors, the amplifiers that we are consistently failing to see, let alone measure?